Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Myles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you are a returning listener or subscriber, so glad to have you here. Welcome back. If you're new to the channel, we have a doozy for you as the entire TIR Central Committee is in the house, so to speak. Before I bring everybody in, a few things that need to be announced. If you don't have it set aside on your calendar already, it's coming up. Pascal and I got our tickets. We're ready to go. We were talking about it beforehand. That's part of the reason why we're so late. June 8th in Washington, D.C. at Busboys and Poets. Beyond the Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James and the Struggle for Socialism in America. Adolph Reed, the Pascal Robert, Daniel Tutt, Derek Varn, me, Jason Myles. 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Should be an exciting event. Actually, exciting. I said that about a speaking engagement. Exciting. Also, this Saturday, after the TIR Free Show, I'll be with Catherine Liu on Montez Press Radio. She'll be streaming live from New York City. Workers of the Culture Industry Unite. It's a new show Catherine Liu is doing. I'll be her first guest. We'll be talking about music and the visual arts. I'm very excited for that. Hope you guys tune in. I'll have links soon. I don't have any right now. But let's bring in the crew. And even before we bring in the crew, I'm just going to bring everybody in. It's the birthday of one deep state Cuba. So can everybody please wish Deep State Cuba a very happy birthday? Pascal Robert, Mean Gene Bajlan, Deep State Cuba, the entire crew. How do you feel, Cuba? Do you feel a year older?
I mean, every additional year feels, I'm just going to say yes to that. Yeah. They kind of accumulate over time. I mean, all of the secrets, right? All of the classified information, right? It gets more and more that you can reveal less and less of.
So Cuba's not even going to speak tonight. Speaking of classified info.
He's got his deep throat lighting.
Yeah,
exactly.
Pascal, you're looking rather slender and happy today.
I was going to say he's got his deep throat lighting. I said pause. He should have said pause with that one.
No, that's the proper lighting.
No, I was saying he said the Cuba deep throat. I said,
No Diddy.
No, that's what the kids are saying now. No Diddy.
No Diddy.
It's not even pause anymore, Pascal. The kids are going no Diddy.
No Diddy.
No Diddy. That's
horrible. This is going to be an interesting episode. I ran this by Gene Bajlan a few weeks ago. And once I mentioned this to the rest of the crew, everybody just wanted to jump in and be a part of this show. So this is going to be a very, very interesting discussion where I'm just going to ask some questions and move out of the way. Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide in 1944. He studied the Nazi occupation of Poland and found there were 5 characteristics of what he called genocide. Those were mass killing, inflicting bodily and mental harm, deterioration of living conditions, preventing births, and he talked about the forced transfer of the young Polish people to Germans. These definitions would prove to be an apt description of what is occurring in Gaza and why many are calling the Israeli war campaign genocidal. Israel and their Western allies are not framing their attack as a genocidal one, but one of self-defense. Israel is simply defending itself against a terrorist threat, an insurgency hiding amongst citizenry, so all people become suspect. No Gazan life is deemed innocent under these rules of engagement. Is this a genocide or is this a war? What is the difference? Is there a difference? Using the definitions of what constitutes a genocide, Gaza is not alone in their suffering. Myanmar, South Sudan, Ethiopia, to name a few, are in similar situations, but the protest and outrage isn't so prevalent in their case. Why are those genocidal conflicts viewed with such indifference? First off, let's pivot back to, I guess, Israel-Palestine, since it is a very serious topic at the moment. We have to admit there's been a paradigmatic shift in the feelings around Palestinian humanity. The constant images of destruction and loss of life, I believe, is playing a massive role in this shift. The term genocide in this regard seems to be helping rally people around the cause for a ceasefire in the Western world. Would you guys agree?
I think that, yes, your characterization is a good one. And I think that it goes back to connecting the dots. The fact that the term genocide is one that has a legal definition.
Mm-hmm.
And it's tied into the Nuremberg trials, the international law that came out of those, as well as the International Criminal Court. So you now have a new kind of standard, something that has a more sort of objective condemnation rather than just like a contest of narratives. And what's unusual is that the most powerful central forces internationally, like specifically the United States, can't seem to push out of that. That's what makes it more significant, rather than the gravity or the nature of the genocidal crimes themselves, which are actually depressingly common.
Jean Bajlan?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to turn back to see how the origins of this term, what the origins of this term are, and how it came into being, and how it fits into our political discourse today. Because, of course, violence is very common, extreme levels of violence are very common, but the term genocide and the legal definition that Cooper points out is not about any type of violence directed against any type group of people, but rather is specifically a type of violence directed against a religious, ethnic, or racial group. So it is, in a sense, a kind of, it's not just violence, but it's violence directed against the people based on their identity, right? And so, that's an important thing to understand. How did this term come into being? So, Cuba, obviously, his co-national Raphael Lemkin, an individual born in what is today Belarus, but is historically, was part of Russia, and then before that part of the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He was an individual born at the very beginning of the 20th century, and he witnessed the kind of intensification of ethnic and religious violence and the arrival of that intense ethnic and religious violence to Europe and the Middle East. When developing the concept of genocide, which he develops at the end of the First World War, he's not just drawing on the example of the Holocaust. We might think of the Holocaust as being the kind of ideal type genocide, just the kind of most extreme form of genocide. But he developed this concept, he developed this concept over an extended period. For example, one of the direct inspirations for thinking about the concept of genocide were the events of the Armenian genocide in 1915. How that played out in the interwar period. Lemkin was a kind of advocate for creating legal safeguards for religious and ethnic communities. Obviously, he was not successful in this, but after the barbarism of the Second World War and the refinement of this concept, this new concept of genocide that comes into being at the end of the First World War, this concept is taken up, and as Cooper points out, becomes a legal concept. So there is a kind of this is a crime that can be litigated in the international court system. So that's the origins of the term genocide, and that is why talking about genocide is it's not just a matter of propaganda for many people, but there are legal implications for this. There's a reason that, for example, Turkey doesn't recognize the Armenian genocide. Why? Because, of course, they fear there are legal implications for that recognition. So Israel obviously doesn't want to be seen as committing a genocide, even if that's what they are doing. But, there's an added level to this because it has legal ramifications for what that means.
And typically, when it comes to legal ramifications, that's been something that applies more to, let's say, middle and lower powers, right? It's extraordinarily dangerous if you're somebody like Slobodan Milosevic to be identified as a genocidaire. Then if that's an accusation that's leveled against Henry Kissinger. At the upper levels of imperial power, states can get away with it, essentially. And their diplomatic influence prevents any kind of judicial reckoning. What's remarkable about the Israeli case is that the United States hasn't been able to manage to float above the surface of legal accountability. Normally, power would be enough to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can't remember where I read it, but there was a journalist who reported, for example, that in private, I think it was the chief prosecutor for the ICC who said that, in conversations, leaders had said, this is for thugs like Putin and leaders in Africa. But the application of kind of accusations of genocide to Israel, which is, a small state, but an influential state in the
and also
system.
The only democracy in the Middle East, and et cetera, having this really ambiguous position as a developed, right,
part of the quote unquote Western world. Yeah. So this is kind of like a sea change in the use of, on the application of genocide law. I think it speaks to perhaps a divide in the global liberal elite over Israel. I think, there is a section of not just, the usual people who are opposing, Israeli oppression of the Palestinians, but even amongst people who are fairly well established within the global foreign policy establishment, that Israel is going too far. Now, of course, Israel is countering by saying, well, this is not a genocide. We're letting aid in. It's not. And they're relying on the idea, of course, that when people hear the word genocide, they think Holocaust. This doesn't look like the Holocaust. This is not Israel. This is not Israel, taking Palestinians to the gas chamber. But what it does look like is the Armenian genocide, the massacre of Bosnian men in Srebrenica, plenty of cases in genocide, because, there's a kind of perception, well, unless they try and exterminate everybody, it can't really be called a genocide. But, to go back to the point that you made at the beginning, to constitute an act of genocide, you have this concept of killing members of a group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on a group conditions for life calculated
collective
to bring about
punishment as well.
Collective punishment, imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group, forcibly transferring of children of one group to another. And that's important to understand because, in theory, you could have a genocide where no one is actually killed, but rather, you sterilize an entire population, seize their children. So, the core aspect of the concept of genocide is not purely related to the level of violence, but the intent of that violence. And that intent of that violence is to liquidate a particular quote unquote identity group. And that's quite specific. So this wouldn't apply, for example, to, let's say, Stalin's campaign against the kulaks, right, against a particular social class. But people might apply that term to the deportation of, I don't know, Koreans into Central Asia as well.
And also, that is was part of the legal contention over enshrining genocide as an international crime, crime against humanity, which categories would be included and excluded. And there's a reason that class identity was kept off of the list, just like sexual identity hadn't become a identifiable, actionable group yet. So originally it was limited to ethnic groups, national groups, religious groups, or racial groups.
Brother Robert.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I want to say about the situation in terms of the utility of the term genocide is that how much I think that one of the few things that we have that I think is valuable that leftists have done in the pre-October 7th era is set the foreground for the universal condemnation of hostility towards the Palestinians by the Israeli state, with things such as the BDS movement and other things, increasing the consciousness of people left of center throughout the globe of the global disdain for the persecution of Palestinian people. What I'm basically saying is that I don't think we have this global outrage that we see in the world without the actual foundations that have been laid in the intermedium, not simply because of actions by the left like BDS, but also because the sheer outrage at the noxious politics of Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't think is any, as much as Netanyahu argues that his job is to protect the sanctity of and sovereignty of Israel, I don't think that there has been an Israeli leader that has done more to politically threaten the sovereignty of the state of Israel through the increasing of the legitimacy of two-state or alternative state solutions than Benjamin Netanyahu. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that his form of political punishment towards Palestinians is so egregious is that it causes the legitimacy of the whole Israeli project to be up for grabs in the consciousness of even the most objective world observer. And it's only in that context that you can find that he is so absurd in the punishment that he lays out that the state of Israel and its leaders could be viewed by the International Criminal Court as potential genocidaires, as Kuba would say. So I am, as Jason opened up the show, somewhat not stunned, but somewhat sanguine with the extent to which the world is waking up to this horrific treatment that is not alone in the world, but I don't think that we should deny didn't get here without some level of work from our comrades on the left, but also as a consequence of this outrageous politics of the Netanyahu administration. I'd like to hear what you guys' thoughts on it.
I agree with that. I want to ask you guys kind of a quick follow-up before we move
Well,
on.
I have a not
Oh, okay,
necessarily
well,
not necessarily a disagreement, but a re-emphasis. So, the Palestinian solidarity movement has been around for a long time. It's very well institutionalized in left circles, in universities. It's been going on for a long time, and as it should, because the issue has not been resolved. And I'm not saying that activism doesn't matter, or the fact that people have protested doesn't matter. But I think there are some specific changes that have been taking place beyond the Palestinian solidarity movement that have facilitated this shift in opinion regarding Israel, making it kind of more difficult for, let's say, Israel's allies to cover up, the ongoing persecution of the Palestinians. Number one of those things is that, throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, while behind the scenes, Israel was expanding settlements, was continuing to do the expropriation of Palestinian lands, was continuing with the military occupation, etc. There was because of the nature of media at that time in the West, discussions of Israel and Palestine were mediated through the mainstream press, and there was at least a kind of idea that there was some kind of negotiation process taking place, number one. And number two, even if you didn't blame everything on the Palestinians, you could say, well, the Israelis and the Palestinians, they Arafat turned down a good deal. Perhaps he shouldn't have turned that down. It's it's six of one, half a dozen of another. So it doesn't. It's just one of those things. These people have been killing each other for ages. What can we do about it? So there's that aspect. That doesn't exist anymore. Like, it's difficult for the mainstream press to control the flow of information. With the rise of social media, people can see with their own eyes what is happening. And yes, there's disinformation out there. Yes, there's pictures from Syria, which are being used, and people are saying that, this is Palestine when it's Syria. But there are just some basic things out there. We see what the Israeli soldiers on TikTok are doing. They're kind of the brutal stuff that they're doing. They're like degrading of Palestinian houses. They're looting, they're plundering, their language. We can hear what the Israeli politicians are saying. If you read the mainstream press, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on the things that, let's say, student protesters, you have 1,000 protesters, and one jackass in that protest says something like, well, all the Jews should go to Poland or something. And then the press picks that up. And then, that's the story. What's not being covered, of course, is what Israeli politicians are saying. That is not in the mainstream media, but social media, people see it. People get people can get direct access to that. So I think there's a lot more information out there. There's a lot more disinformation out there, but people are beginning to see that the whole only democracy in the Middle East discourse is not the reality of what's happening. Another tendency I want to emphasize is I think there is an elite level split on the Israel-Palestine question. There is a split amongst the foreign policy establishment, and that split amongst the foreign policy establishment in the US as well as in other parts of the world has been facilitated by the rightward drift of Israeli politics over the last decade and a half. The kind of rise of right populism, which alienates, your like liberal foreign policy establishments. The Israeli diplomatic corps, the Israeli influence operation in the West historically was very good at projecting the idea that Israel was a normal Western democracy in a tough neighborhood, right? But over the last decade, you've seen Bibi Netanyahu, especially in the United States, intervene directly in American politics. Now, that hasn't necessarily filtered through to the elected politicians. Both Democrats and Republicans, by and large, are generally supportive of Israel, with a few exceptions. But I think within the foreign policy establishment, and I think Kuba could speak to this as well, there is a sense like Israel is just out of control. They're not even allowing the United States to maintain the cover that the long-term objective is a two-state solution, because the Israelis are saying contradictory things. They're saying for example, they say Hamas wants to destroy Israel. They're against the two-state solution. Therefore, any move towards a two-state solution would be rewarding Hamas. That doesn't make sense unless, of course, when they say Hamas, what they really mean is the entire Palestinian population. And along with the right politics, the rise of these hardcore religious movements in Israel, the settler groups, the rightward drift of the Israeli youth. We always associate the youth with being progressive. In a place like Israel, that's not the case. The youth is generally more nationalistic. With the outflowing of liberal Israelis, many of whom will get sick of it and move to Germany and places like that, Israel is becoming a more hardline right-wing country. It's bleeding into this kind of populist discourse, which is alienating liberals. That's why you see a lot of liberals who are now critical of Israel, being critical of Israel, but framing it in terms of Bibi Netanyahu and his, bad settler buddies. And they want to kind of get back to the old kind of Ashkenazi, Europeanized elites, rather than, someone like Ben Gvir as my Kurdish brother, right? Because he's a Mizrahi Jew. One of the things that a lot of the discourse about Israel-Palestine gets wrong is like, they're all Polish and Lithuanian. No, they're not all Polish and Lithuanian. The vanguard of some of the most hardcore groups are Mizrahi Jews. People from Mizrahi is a kind of like a neologism. It's like the brown Jews, right? They're people who were kicked out of all the Arab countries in 1948 and who don't have a place to go, and so who engage in the kind of typical sectarian politics that you see in other parts of the Middle East, right? Who are like, religious fanatics. Lebanon, right? So I think the solidarity movement is important to consider, but it has to be understood in the context of splits over Israel and the global elite, the transformation of Israel over the last decade, the increase, like someone like
Israel has also become.
Just a final point. Someone like Ben Gavir, and the Khanis, these were extremists, right? These were people who were like associated with Yitzhak Rabin's assassination.
And Meir Kahane, the
Kahanis.
He's kind of a celebrity reactionary among rabbis.
Yeah, so you have this. These people were seen as fringe in Israel, right? These guys are now at the core center of power. And these guys won't stop saying genocidal things, as much as the Israeli state is trying to say, like, we're not doing a genocide. If we wanted to do a genocide, we'd kill even more people. Well, that's not a good excuse.
Not reassuring, by the way.
Not at all. That's like the worst thing ever.
But
and let me just make one. People will say, well, the Israelis let aid in and things like that. And so, yes, there might be bad people. This is how genocides usually are. In the Armenian genocide, Armenians were mass murdered, but the American Red Cross was allowed to operate in refugee camps for Armenians in the Syrian desert.
And
right?
even in the Holocaust,
in the Holocaust, you had like the
Red Cross was moving packages around, and there had to be a parallel registry for individuals because the real mistreatment was being denied officially, right? Whereas, even in the most extreme cases, there's still this veneer of civility and deniability around the genocide as it's taking place.
I want to ask,
but I think
okay, all right, you guys are just killing me today.
Sorry, I just wanted to. There's one thing that I wanted to mention, which is how costly Israel has become as an ally for the United States. I think that the strategic calculus has also shifted around that part of the equation. The Abraham Accords were kind of a high risk, high reward Hail Mary that was supposed to rewrite the diplomatic balance back towards a more sustainable pro-Israel direction. But now it's clear that it's going to be extremely challenging just to provide diplomatic cover for Israeli behavior, let alone the implications if you need to go beyond writing a blank check, but actually integrate into operations in the area. It would be incredibly costly. So I think that sobering awareness is making some of the foreign policy establishment in the West a little more gun shy when it comes to providing Israel, which is also exacerbating this by its own behavior, by its own policies. It's part of the problem. It's part of what's driving the risk. Like, maybe you want to take a couple of steps back before it all blows up.
How do political motivations differ in war than in genocide? And are there any moral differences?
Well, my hot take is that all modern total wars have an inherent genocidal logic to them, because modern total wars are not just about, defeating enemy armies on the battlefield, but also the destruction of, infrastructure, transportation, industry, attacks on civilian populations, etc. So I think there's something in modern warfare that is kind of inherently genocidal. So I don't think there's a clear dividing line between total war and genocide, although, obviously as a legal term, intent matters. But, the genocide, the definition of genocide is very open, destruction of a group in whole or in part. Well, when you bomb a civilian population with the intention of killing large numbers of them in order to force them to surrender. Is that, destroying a people in part? That seems like an intention to do genocide. So I think the nature of total war in the modern era, this full mobilization of society, it has this entire just genocidal logic. I don't think it's an accident that it's the First and the Second World War which provide Lemkin with the kind of inspiration, as it were, to develop this concept of genocide. So I think the line between a vicious war and a genocide is a difficult one to draw, and ultimately is a political one to draw. Right? What gets accepted as a genocide and what gets not accepted as a genocide tends to be, what do people in power in the global system want to view as a genocide, and what do they not want to view as a genocide?
Here's a question. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kuba. Go ahead.
And it's pretty simple to game that logic, right? If you're worried that you might need to do a light genocide in order to win over your adversaries in a given conflict, just don't say the word, right? It's almost like mafia style rules. Don't admit to crimes in any formal public statements. Don't write anything down, right? Officially, it's just a war, right? And what's one of the things that's shocking about Israel's behavior is how it less and less bothers to maintain the pretense that its goal isn't to kill massive amounts of Gazan civilians. That is actually part of the thing that's shocking and somewhat unprecedented about this conflict.
Pascal?
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that have always shocked me about one of the things I found out about Israel that really was what their policies was the sterilization campaigns against Afro-Ethiopian Jews. And I was like, hold on, these people actually sterilize Afro-Ethiopian Jews? Well, if they do that to Afro-Ethiopian Jews, what do they do to Palestinians?
It's insane, right?
Yeah.
Here's a question I have for you guys. Kind of a follow-up here on the idea of what are the political motivations. Israel claims that there's a terrorist group called Hamas that is threatening their right to exist. Does that threat then constitute this as a war?
Well, that's how genocides begin. I mean, the Armenian genocide, what triggered the Armenian genocide? Obviously, tensions between Armenians and the Ottoman government had been growing for time. But when the First World War broke out, a small number of Armenian revolutionaries joined the Russian military, and as part of their campaign in Eastern Anatolia. And what happened during this moment, and there's an interesting parallel with the Israelis here. What happened was, at the beginning of the First World War, the military doctrine, at least when fighting Russia, was to try and rapidly advance, surround them, and then with a smaller military, you'd be able to cause the poorly disciplined Russian army to panic retreat. The Germans had executed this, very successfully in Russian-controlled Poland at the beginning of the war, and the Ottoman Generalissimo Enver Pasha, buoyed by the fact that there was unseasonably good weather in the autumn of 1914, launched an offensive from Eastern Anatolia into the Russian-controlled Caucasus, a region where there's a large Armenian population, some living in the Russian Empire, some living in the Ottoman Empire. Now, some Armenian revolutionaries, there were Armenians, I should note, in the Ottoman military at the time, but some Armenian revolutionaries had taken this opportunity and joined the Russians. And when the weather changed very quickly, the Ottomans weren't prepared for it. And the Battle of Sarikamish, the Russians really inflicted defeat on the Ottoman army, humiliate the Generalissimo, and there's a desire to find a scapegoat. Well, who do they find the scapegoat of? Well, they blame the Armenians. This number of Armenians that had joined the Russian, and they accuse the Armenians of of doing, like trying to murder the Muslim population. You have uprisings taking place, and so you have this like descent alongside the kind of war of fronts. You have this descent into intercommunal violence. And so the state, partly because of his own military failures, strongly scapegoats the Armenian community. And I think we see a similar dynamic with Israel. Part of the story of October the 7th was complete Israeli mismanagement of the border with Gaza from a military perspective, because Bibi Netanyahu had redeployed Israeli soldiers from the Gaza border to the West Bank to assist in the ongoing expropriation of Palestinian lands in the West Bank. So when October the 7th happens, it's not just the matter of Hamas that's like the easy target, but the entire Palestinian population comes to be associated with the terrorist organization, quote unquote terrorist organization, just as the same way as the entire Armenian population comes to be associated with the various, what the Ottoman government regarded as Armenian terrorist organizations. So we have a kind of confluence of factors that come together to create, or at least create the perception of an existential crisis. And the only resolution for that existential crisis is the deploying of genocidal levels of violence, either to entirely wipe out a population or rather thin out the population to manageable levels.
Do Americans not understand genocide outside of the lens of the Nazis in World War II? I mean, there's tons of Americans that don't even know about it.
I don't think Americans understand genocide in the context, in the lens of World War II.
Tell me how you really feel.
I don't
think Americans understand anything within the context of world history at all.
Yeah, I think you're all precisely, Pascal.
If it's not Monday Night Football, it's a wrap.
I think the only context that exists for them is at the Nuremberg trials, somebody won and somebody lost, right? And then so you had an authority, a referee who could say, you're guilty and you're bad. You did a genocide. Now you have to be Germany and we get to be the United States. And I think that is a very reassuring notion that if this kind of stuff happens, there's a process and it seems to always work out in your favor. But to actually consider what genocide looks like on the ground, the things that real people tell themselves that enable that kind of violence, and the terrible things that the survivors have to do in order to be survivors, right? I don't think that horror is in the American historical imagination, no.
If the international community has declared a situation of genocide, what should the international response be? Pascal?
I think I like the idea of the ICC going in and arresting and trying the leaders of the Les Génocidaires, meaning Netanyahu and his nationalist thugs.
Mean Gene Bajlan.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know what can be done. I mean, maybe the International Court will do something. Maybe they won't. I mean, I'm not very optimistic about how this pans out because, of course, without the power of the United States or with the protection of the United States, I don't think anyone is going to be held accountable in Israel. So I don't really know what can be done short of, well, no, I'm not going to pretend that I know what the answer is because I don't. What should the international community do? Whatever it takes to stop at least the Israelis with this military offensive. Are they going to do that? I don't know.
I think that these developments are more interesting for what they say about a bigger change in the global political landscape. If right now, what should be a settled question, what shouldn't even produce this level of dissent and pushback, of embarrassment to the peak superpower, if this can happen, well, that suggests that that power is on the wane, and we'll see what happens next time, right? It's a little like how the People's Republic of China has been whittling away all the countries that recognize Taiwan as the one China. Eventually, there'll be some point where you do have successful BDS movements in countries that matter enough. So the Israeli position begins to decline more and more rapidly until it becomes untenable. And what then? Who knows? But it suggests we're going in that direction rather than the other.
So I want to reinterpret what Kuba is saying to make sure that I'm not mistaken here. Are you saying that the current negative direction in which the public perception of the activities in Palestine is going is not only weakening the Israeli position in the world, but by proxy weakening the United States because of its unlimited support of Israel?
Yeah, I would say that that follows. Every time the United States needs to intervene, it has to expend more and more of its diplomatic capital, and each misbehavior by Israel makes it much more difficult to reestablish those, let's call them leadership resources, right? The willingness of your putative allies and underlings to actually listen to you. And I think that right now it's a negative feedback loop. It's dangerous for both parties, but it will, maybe something bigger will change, but otherwise it feels like, although it may take a while, the situation is not developing to Israel's advantage.
Kuba, and I guess I have this question for everybody, but I'll ask it to you directly. What does that then mean with the Iranian situation? The president.
With
Israel and Iran.
And you mean the development, the helicopter crash, and my understanding of the Iranian internal politics is limited, but I think that it shifts the burden towards a different segment that still belongs to the most aggressive resistance against the West and Israel. I would say there's not going to be a diplomatic adjustment on that end. I don't think in either direction, but I think the tendency will be to maintain a high level of pressure on Israel.
I would also add that, the Iranians don't want an out and out war with the Israelis. If you notice the kind of provocative acts that have been taking place, it's all the Israelis provoking, right? The Iranians firing those missiles at Israel was the result of Israel, completely spitting on international norms and bombing an Iranian consulate in Syria. So the Israelis, I think there are at least elements, and I don't think this is universal in the Israeli military establishment, because there are splits in the Israeli military establishment over this. We've seen kind of splits inside Israel, the split between Bibi and his kind of right-wing allies and the old quote-unquote liberal Zionist elite that controlled the country, the protests, etc., etc. Those splits, I think, exist in the military. There's a lot of anger in the military about Bibi's mismanagement of the war, etc., etc. This is all being papered over by the kind of bloodlust that seems to be gripping at the Israeli politics. But those splits haven't disappeared. And I think Bibi perhaps calculates that, it doesn't look good what Israel is doing. They're just murdering mass numbers of children, right? That's what people see, right? Yeah. Turning this into a broader regional war with Hezbollah, Iran, and stuff. Suddenly that changes the calculus. Suddenly Israel is the David, and the whole Middle East is the Goliath. And that was a narrative that had been working before. The Iranians aren't taking the bait, right? Because they have major internal problems. Their economy is in the toilet. People in Iran are angry, right? People in Iran are angry for just bread and butter issues. The political elite, especially the Iranian military-industrial complex, the Revolutionary Guards, have been getting richer and richer. There's this kind of embourgeoisement of certain elements.
And also, the conditions around Syria and Iraq are no longer desperate either.
Yeah. And Iran has more important strategic objectives: maintaining its influence and control in Iraq. The Iraqi government is trying to limit Iranian influence. They've got to maintain it there. They've got their allies. They're supporting movements in Lebanon. In Yemen, in Syria. They don't need this war, right? They don't want this war. They don't. They're not pushing for this war. Israel is trying to, I think, provoke this war. Now, I think people will come up with conspiracy theories for 100 years from now. But I think the easiest explanation for what happened was Iran has an aviation fleet that is extremely old, many of which were bought during the Shah's reign. So they're over 45 years old. Sanctions mean that they can't get spare parts. And so this kind of stuff happens, right? I don't think the Israelis took out the Iranian president while he was visiting an Israeli ally, Aliyev, the leader of Azerbaijan, right? I think that's just like an X factor. Will it make a difference? I don't think Raisi is a kind of unimaginative bureaucrat who is tied to the Iranian the broader Iranian political establishment. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference. I think that was just kind of an X factor that came out of nowhere that no one could have predicted. Maybe I'll be proved wrong and there's a big conspiracy behind it, but I just suspect that this was just an accident, and I don't think it will change the Iranian attitude.
If there is anything that comes out of it, I don't think it will come out of the Israeli end, but the implications for Iran might be, like you said, Gene, the economic condition, the level of political discontent in Iran is at very serious levels. This may or may not be enough for the balance of domestic forces to shift to another sustained large protest movement. That could also happen.
Are there ideological differences between a genocide and a war?
Well, yes. And this is one reason why the prosecuting the Nazis was really easy. If the crime is seeking the destruction in whole or in part of another group, and built into your ideology and your diplomatic program, your security program, is a commitment to the destruction, in whole or in part, of most of your neighbors, it's going to be very easy to prove, right? If you have an ideology that tends towards ethno-nationalism and realpolitik and militarism, then what you believe in already before the fighting even starts might be enough to justify or sustain charge of genocide if the fighting does start.
Pascal?
I definitely think that there can be ideologies that are different, because the tactics necessary to maintain a war don't have to be genocidal. A war can be a temporary attempt over battles for logistical purposes that don't require total annihilation of your opponent, while genocide is something that requires their ultimate removal from the face of the earth. So there's no question to me that the ideologies can be different, but at the same time, we've seen in cases where the ideologies can be the same that motivate both. And also, one thing that can happen is that war can start off with a completely less mercenary ideology than genocide, and can turn into a genocide, just like a revolution can become genocidal at a certain point.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Pascal. And that also, it becomes very difficult to then judge ideologically whether the problem is the condition which one power sets the terms over whether or not this is a people's war, and the other has to abide by them, or if there's a mutualism to that process. Because it's, again, the World War II is just such an obvious case. When the other side is very obvious in its genocidal intention, well, how else are you supposed to respond if that's the terms of the conflict?
And not everything that is bad has to be genocide, right? I think that often also gets missed as well. Somebody in the chat mentioned the Iraq War. Was the Iraq War genocidal? Well, there may have been genocidal acts during that war, and I think that's an important thing that we should point out. You might have a war where maybe the whole intent isn't genocidal, but you'll have military units, particular massacres where there is definitely a genocidal intent in there. So was the Iraq War genocidal? Not really in that sense. Was it good? No. I mean, does it matter that the intent of the United States was not to genocide the Iraqi people? I mean, the human cost was still enormous, right? It's like it's like the historical debates over the famine in Ukraine during the 1930s, right? As a lot of people died, right? And the dispute is over whether it was a deliberate genocide against the Ukrainian people, or it was just like an accident, right? Or that it was just
or it was a deliberate genocide, but not against the Ukrainians, against a category that is okay to genocide.
Yeah. So, like you have a lot of different kind of policies taking place. Like, look at the history of the United States and its Native American population. You go through various phases of accommodation and then genocidal levels of violence, right? This is like this is the story of the 19th century. Is a lot of these kind of genocide things were pioneered not in, they came to Europe in the 20th century, but they were all tried out in in Africa and Asia in the previous 150 years. What happened to the Herero people in Namibia? There is a perverse historical kind of factoid I like to point out, is that the brown shirts that the Nazis were famous for were taken from the German Southwest Africa Company, which had basically launched a genocide against the Herero people, forcing them out into the desert and basically shooting anybody who came off that reservation. We see colonial genocides in the Americas, in Canada, all over the world. Australia, you go on and on about it. It is just endless stories. Go back even to like another good example might be like the Irish potato famine, right? The potato famine probably wasn't a deliberate genocide. It was probably the reason you have the massive murder of
the mass stuff. Just incompetence.
No, it's not incompetence. It's freaking libertarian economics, right? Let me, like the conservatives who were not in power. The conservatives would have just like sent them some millet and give them some food, whereas the liberals who were in power during the potato famine were like, Let the market sort it out. They were literally exporting food, right? Now, that's not a genocide according to like intention, but it's still insanely evil, right? It's still like letting people.
Do you
die.
need to have a word to define evil acts?
Yeah.
Well, no, but you do need a word to define crimes. And that's, not to be pedantic about it, but that's where the term genocide develops this particular strength and this particular power. That it's more than just an evil thing. It's a crime that somebody, presumably the ICC or maybe some other kind of tribunal, might actually charge you with. There might actually be some accountability. At least so much of what's terrible in the world can't even be called a crime. But this is one case where, yeah, you're crossing that line for everybody.
Got it. Why aren't there protests for Myanmar? It might be a larger displacement of people than Gaza. Is it because many in the West don't know who the bad guys are?
I think that I think that Pascal is what he said at the beginning is very important. The amount of energy and resources that have been put into activism and the creation of networks across the left with Palestinian solidarity. I think that means that the crimes that are happening in Gaza don't have the same, don't suffer the same invisibility as those in places like Myanmar, elsewhere. And I think that most of the world is a bit of a clean sheet for Westerners, especially when the conflicts aren't part of a bigger geopolitical drama, but instead are locals fighting locals for very murky reasons, groups that you've never heard of. And the difference, the thing that's extraordinary is really how successful the Palestinian cause has been at maintaining, defining, and preserving the awareness of the whole story for so long.
Gene?
What was the question again?
See, the typical American.
Sorry, I was getting distracted. Why aren't people protesting for Myanmar? Why aren't they protesting for Sudan, etc., etc.? I mean, there's a couple of reasons, but I would say there's the issue of U.S. funding, etc., etc., etc. But what I think is perhaps more important is the fact that we always been gaslit about Israel. Like nobody's going around and like saying, well, Myanmar is the only democracy in Southeast Asia, and we should support the military junta there, or like that Sudan is, the Sudanese, the Janjaweed militia or whatever they're calling themselves these days, are like a national liberation force. I mean, there's lots of terrible things that come around, but with Israel, there's a couple of things which play into it. One of it is obviously the United States kind of direct involvement in it. There's also the bloody gaslighting that takes place about it. Like they're like, you're mad to think that the Israelis would do this. It's like we're just gaslit about what's been going on, and people just like lose their minds. And then they go, why are you getting mad about it? Is it because you're an anti-Semite? It's like, no, man, you're just like, these things are happening. And whenever anybody says anything, you're like, why are you obsessed with Jews? Why are you an anti-Semite, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a kind of like, why are you getting mad, bro? A response, and people get extremely frustrated by it because we're seeing what is happening on the ground, right? And yet, like, and I think a lot of people are like feel like they were duped for years about the Israel-Palestine discourse. They were like, I thought it was one thing, but I'm seeing these pictures, and this doesn't look like what I've been told. So I think a lot of people kind of like, I think this becomes like a lightning rod for people to begin to see, like, they have, what is it? They have the the like the myths, like the idea, like one of the things, like that is so central to the American view of itself as a righteous power during the Second World War is, it's the Holocaust, the barbarism of the Holocaust, the suffering of the Jewish community, and intimately linked with that is the idea that the Jewish people need a homeland, and that's like that was a very powerful idea, and this idea that and I think Kuba touched on this, the idea that people who have suffered tremendously, there's this view that they must be good out of that suffering. No, that doesn't make good people, right? That makes traumatized people, and traumatized people will do crazy things to survive. And so, there's this idea that of quote unquote innocence, and I think that's kind of breaking down as well under the reality of what people are seeing and what's going on. So we have, I think Israel is a kind of a lightning rod, as it were, because who's out there, let's say, defending the Moroccan government for the occupation of Western Sahara and saying that Morocco is the only democracy in North Africa, and we should, no one's getting called, nobody's getting fired for critiquing the Moroccan government, right? But people are being facing sanctions for critiquing Israel. Yes, sometimes those critiques might be motivated by anti-Semitism. There are a lot of groups that have a axe to grind against Israel, some of them for not savory reasons. But the majority of people in this movement are just disgusted about this, and disgusted about the American hypocrisy about it and the gaslighting that's around it.
Pascal?
I think one of the things that we have to realize is that this, part of the mythology that America tells itself about its righteous purpose in the world revolves notions of Zionism, particularly the whole Christian nation. There's a lot of that mythology that it's tied into that evangelical Christianity that has been perverted into supporting the state of Israel. And a place like Myanmar doesn't have that. There's a messianic Christianity that exists that's part of America going back to the 19th century that is rooted in supporting these kind of narratives that you could see when you watch any of these religious zealots on television, on the 700 Club or whatever, and you see that. You can see that in terms of who are the Christian Zionist movement. It's pretty extensive. So I think that part of that project is ingrained with some of the mythology that the United States tells itself that actually have nothing to do with the state of Israel, but more to say about what kind of projects America will invest itself in. And Myanmar is just, hey man, it's just a bunch of yellow people to the U.S. These aren't, Europeans going home to settle.
Do you feel it's the same way? We talked about this with Bill Fletcher Jr. when we did this episode about Western Sahara. Is it the same thing with Africa, where it's like, well, these black people are just backwards? We don't see a white face oppressing them, so.
Well,
I think there is an opinion out there that settler colonial states stick together. So the reason the United States supports Israel is because they have some kind of commonality as settler colonial societies. I don't buy that. I think that's just like some rad lib kind of explanation, and it doesn't actually get to the real heart of the issue. Is American imperialism doesn't have any kind of fundamental strategic interest in the protection of Israel, because if it didn't, AIPAC wouldn't have to exist, and they wouldn't have to lobby, and they wouldn't have to do all that kind of.
It would already be the
it would all
51st state.
it would already be the 51st state. I think, part of it is for a variety of historical reasons. I mean, the United States was against the formation of the State of Israel. The first country to recognize the State of Israel was the Soviet Union. The State of Israel was founded with weapons supplied from the Czech Republic, courtesy of the Soviet Union. The Americans were very skeptical about it. And also American Jewry was skeptical of Israel as well, because they were like, hey, wait, are you guys trying to just kick us all out of America and send us all off to this country in the Middle East?
It's just starting to get good here.
It's just starting to get, we're just finally allowed to join the country club and you want to kick us out? So that, so you had this a very important aspect of this is that, Israel has groomed the American Israel Jewish community to build a kind of affinity with the State of Israel, to regard the State of Israel as their old country, even though their old countries are all, for most American Jews, the old country is, Poland, Lithuania, Germany, places like that. But there's been, been this kind of, you have these things like birthright, where any American Jewish person can go back for a kind of junket tour of Israel and things like that. So there's this kind of attempt to build a base of support amongst the American Jewish community, who will, by proxy,
support in a
Israel.
lot of ways, it's the same as an entry point into a religious way of life, right? You part of the goal is to not just expose people, but to start relationships, right, with young American Jews, with one another, with people on the Israeli side, make being binational normal and positive part of your identity that you're constructing at that point.
And it's very difficult to, and because of the history of anti-Semitism, real conspiracy theories, real kind of vicious stuff that is deeply embedded in Western society, that is is very much in the DNA. Like the Jew is the first is the first other internal enemy of Christendom, and this becomes kind of secularized and racialized in the modern era. Because of that very real history, it becomes a minefield to critique this, because dual loyalty was a very real charge directed against Jews across across Europe. The Dreyfus affair was a defining issue in the French Third Republic. A defining issue of the treatment of a Jewish officer, his conviction on completely phony charges of treachery and things like that. It's kind of
undermined the belief of groups across the political spectrum in any kind of assimilationist project. If even a figure like Dreyfus could be hung out to dry by his superiors, by that are supposed to be meritocratic military people.
And so, although the Israeli state's objective is to promote a dual loyalty, towards your home country and towards the State of Israel, this is what it's all about. It's very difficult to say that, precisely because there is a history of that accusation being used to promote abuse of Jewish people around the world. So, because of the spiciness of the history of anti-Semitism in the West, we have this really difficult time talking about it, because it is simultaneously both true that the Israeli state does seek to promote, a base of support amongst the global Jewish community, while at the same time, it is equally true that there has been a kind of long history of anti-Semitism, which have always pursued, tried to present Jews as, disloyal elements, poisonous elements within a particular society. And sometimes the line between people who are making the honest critique and people who are making the anti-Semitic critique is really hard to see. Even if you just read the words of someone, you don't know what's in their heart in saying that. So it's difficult.
Thank you guys for hanging out today, having this very informative conversation. We will be back Saturday. A little bit of a lighter show. We're going to be talking about Diddy Kendrick and Drake, and AI. It'll be a fun show. Joined by Justin Hunt. Thank you, Pascal. Thank you, Jean Bajlan. Happy birthday, Deep State Cuba. And can you guys all wish Cuba a very happy birthday? I'll be going into the champagne room. I don't know if any of these guys are going to be joining me. Are you guys all logging off? Or are you joining me for the champagne room?
I'll try to come for some champagne. I can't stay too long.
Yeah, I can't stay too long, but I can come for a little bit. It's like Jason's like, it's the lights have come on at the nightclub and he's inviting us back to his place for a night.
The hookers are all at my house, man.
No, Pascal's more worried about what's happening in the Diddy room.
We're trying to pull him out of the Diddy room right now. Thank you guys so much. If you want to join us for the champagne room, it's very simple. Patreon.com/BitterLakePresents. As little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. You can have access to past champagne rooms, past and present. Join us for movie nights and so much more. We are out.